So there's something that I want to illustrate here with why I think player-coach relationships struggle at times right now. And it's something that I just called the Great Divergence. So I've been on some Zoom calls with facility owners, with scouts, with coaches, and there's this general struggle to communicate. It's how do we work with a player when we know that players are supposed to challenge coaches to be better, yet when do they cross that line of becoming uncoachable, where they don't want to listen to what it is we have to share? So in learning, there's something called the zone of proximal development, and that's just fancy talk for meaning you can't learn about next until you learn about now, right? So here's now, and then the zone of proximal development simply means that you can't learn what comes next until you know what you're supposed to know now. And then when you know now, then you can grow and you can learn what comes next. And that's how I interpret that. Well, the player of 2020 is not the player of 1980, 1990, 2000 even. Like, they just have so many experiences and opportunities presented to them. I saw a tweet or something on Instagram. Christian Yelich commented that you can't just execute what you see on the gram, and I thought that was hilarious. And that sort of speaks to the player of 2020, where let's call this the player of 1980 or 1990 in my case. So what was true then is the player of 1980, there was no way that player had more experiences than the coach of 1980. It was impossible to have more experiences. And then because we didn't have as many experiences, our knowledge couldn't grow. We couldn't build on next. So there was this obvious gap that the coach could communicate to the player. The coach had higher ground, as I like to say, and the player always showed up and he was willing to listen. Well, what's happened now, the 2020 player often is now sitting up there. And I'm not saying that he's actually in a better position, but he certainly had more experiences on Instagram and Twitter and Snapchat, and however he wanted to learn. YouTube, certainly. Facilities have popped up across the country. There's just so many opportunities to grow that these nows are becoming more and more common. And the more that we know, the more we can grow. So what's happening is these coaches, they invest all their time in uniform and coaching and hitting fungos, and they don't get to study research and the data, and they have to literally function on what it is they know. It's not. You can't coach someone on what you think is true. You have to coach someone on what you believe to be true. And these coaches coach based on their experiences. The problem is the player they're inheriting now has often built up such a reservoir of knowledge that player is now this isn't necessarily reality, but it is the perception that they show up with all of this information that the 1980 player had no way of knowing. So this is a struggle, and this is really difficult sometimes for the coach to navigate, because what used to be the case is it was this top-down instruction where the coach could demand of the player, and he had experience on his side. So I'm not saying it was always the case, but it was certainly more common where a coach back in my day could just fire away at a player with an assumption and understanding that he would readily listen. Well, now you've got these players showing up in the coach's presence, and they're not this blank slate. They've got all of this knowledge that's been built up through all of these experiences, whether they've been real or artificial. They're still experiences. And now this great divergence there's this huge gap right here that coaches and players have to navigate. And this is a real struggle for today's coaches and today's players. And my brother uses a hashtag humility wins. And I really think in today's culture, I really think that's the only way that you navigate that gap, is that you at least recognize that this player is showing up with so much more information than what he used to show up with. And the only way that you can narrow that gap and influence that person is at least admitting that what it is he knows. I'm not saying it has to be true, but you have to at least recognize that it could be in fact credible, that he learned it from a facility or he learned it from a trusted coach on YouTube. Now, what I also think is true is when you talk to scouts and people in Major League Baseball, this gap has caused a lot of distrust. And they're trying to close that gap with data. So this is where the data fits. The data is sitting in this gap because players aren't trusting these coaches that don't have all the information that they have. So as a necessary evil, they basically use data to fill that gap, okay? And I guess in some respects, that's the best that we can do right now, is that if there is distrust with coaches, at least the data is something that we can navigate and follow. But what I believe is true, I believe that this guy right here, this guy with experience on his side, his experience is certainly something that we just can't deny. Like we can't say that every one of those moments in time is created equally. Like we can't do that. We have to recognize that time spent in a batter's box facing Randy Johnson that has the ability to throw a 2-1 slider can affect how you grow and how you teach the game of baseball. So what I think is true is I think the idea of humility wins permeates today's culture. It's the only way that we can succeed. I've gone on record as saying that the coach, he wants to achieve enough to be credible, but doubt enough to be relevant. And that's sort of what I'm talking about, that you have to know that these people might need to hear the information communicated a different way. And these people need to know that it doesn't matter how much time you spend learning, nothing is quite as valuable as learning from that dude that was in the box and had trial under pressure, right? So I think this is the new model. I think humility wins, recognizing that ultimately it's this guy on the front lines, it's this guy that competes, it's this guy that needs to be supremely confident, and this guy has now got to recognize that the struggle that 2020 presents essentially is with respect to how many opportunities they have to grow now. So that's just something I wanted to share. I labeled it the Great Divergence. It's something that I see when I get on these calls and chat with facility owners or coaches or scouts or anyone. But this is something I wanted to share.